Hi guys, it's Debbie, and today I'm here to speak about everything I watched in March. This way I'll be able to give my short opinion on all the films and series I watched, as well as offer some ideas about projects you might enjoy. An important note before getting right into the video is that every single title on today's list is available online. As you know, Italy is in a complete lockdown. We're not allowed to leave our houses and cinemas have been closed for basically 2 months now. Probably your country has also taken measures to prevent the spread of the new coronavirus, and the best idea in general at the moment is to stay at home. So don't worry, every single film or series you will see on this list today is available on various streaming platforms, Netflix, Hulu, Prime Video, you name it. And if it isn't available there, you can always rent it or purchase it on various sites, even here on YouTube. Now let's check these films out. So March opened with a film from the 90s, and you will see that there will be other older films on today's list because I've been trying to catch up with my watch list while there aren't that many new films being released at the moment. The first film I watched is called Primal Fear, a thriller starring Edward Norton in his first role ever, but for which he was actually nominated for an Oscar. In Primal Fear, Norton portrays a young, shy man who is accused of murder in a very high-profile case. His lawyer is portrayed by Richard Gere, who has the role of the arrogant overachiever who at first sees the case just as a means to be in the spotlight, but who soon gets dragged deep into the case as the murder case thickens and there is a lot more than what meets the eye. Everything in the case points to the accused, but his personality is so shy, so fearful, that it makes people question the whole situation even more. I've always loved Edward Norton's acting, and to see him already as a professional in his first film role ever really got me excited. And in general, I couldn't believe I'd never seen this film before because it's totally up my genre alley, and I would highly recommend watching it. After Primal Fear, I watched a series I absolutely loved, although the topic it covers is definitely not one of the happiest. The series is called The Act, and it covers the real-life story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard, a girl who in the public eye was seen suffering from a multitude of health conditions, as well as always being in a wheelchair, being fed through a tube, always taking various medications, wearing hearing aids, wigs, you name it. Because of the cost of the condition, she receives a lot of donations, including a brand new house where she lives with her mother. But as the years go by, Gypsy starts to think for herself, she forms her own personality, she meets people beyond just her mother, and she starts to wonder whether she actually has these conditions or whether she is forced by her mother to live like that. And from that moment, things start to spiral out of control. This series is very well put together. It doesn't just throw facts out there, it focuses a lot on the mother-daughter relationship, on the psychological consequences of that lifestyle, on the feelings of guilt and power, and I think the two protagonists were wonderfully portrayed by Joey King and Patricia Arquette. The next film I watched instead is one I wouldn't recommend as much. It's one I didn't really enjoy that much, and that is Spencer Confidential. Now, I hate kicking off with a title I didn't like. It makes me appear like one of those film snobs. But stay tuned because there is a lot on our way, including Shia LaBeouf slapping tanning lotion onto Elvis Presley's granddaughter's legs. Returning to Spencer Confidential, in general it received wide publicity before its release, but then it was hardly spoken about just a few days after people had started watching it, as many hadn't really felt engaged by it. Spencer Confidential is an action film in which Mark Wahlberg portrays a former police officer who ends up in jail for beating up one of his superiors. When he is released from jail years later, odd events start to happen. People start to get seriously hurt or killed, and everything points in his direction because all the victims are tied to him somehow. So he has to try and figure out what is going on and defend his innocence. The premise is quite interesting, and Mark Wahlberg is always very good in his roles, but I just never felt engaged by the story. I never enjoyed it by being caught up in the events, and it seemed rather like a bland bunch of action sequences rather than the pain and gain style plot we were all expecting. But I know many did enjoy it, so if you have seen this film, please leave a comment below letting me know your opinion on it. Then, as I was mentioning earlier, not having the opportunity of watching many new film releases, I have been catching up with some older titles on my watch list, and a film I had been meaning to watch for ages was The Deer Hunter, starring Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, John Cazale, Meryl Streep, just to name some. In The Deer Hunter, a group of very close friends is sent to fight in the Vietnam War, a time during which, in addition to physical struggles and physical consequences, the protagonists suffer deeply on a psychological level, with some of them carrying the effects in the long term. So the film analyses many topics, including strong friendships and how those friendships stick even in the toughest moments, the effects war has on the mind, how interacting in society becomes very hard, and also how your conception of death and the value you give to life change after experiencing life at war. So it gets pretty dark in some moments. I'm very pleased I finally watched this film. It gave me a lot of food for thought, even though I have never ever experienced anything even close to what the characters have to go through. It's a very interesting project. Then one evening, even to please a younger member of the family, we were deciding whether to rewatch Zootopia or Sing, two animated films which feature animals as the characters. Now, although I would have preferred to rewatch Zootopia, in the end, the decision was for Sing. I could vaguely remember the general idea behind the film. So basically, different animals who audition for a music competition set up by a failing theatre owner as his last hope to get business back and running. But I definitely couldn't remember how the plot carried on from there, and all the various smaller details which in the end as adults become the funniest part of the film. For example, there's a group of cute dogs who are auditioning as the stereotypical East Asian pop girl group routine, and it's absolutely hilarious, with Matthew McConaughey as the koala trying to speak Japanese with them. If you're looking for something quick, light-hearted and fun, this could be a good idea. That same evening, I watched a very different film called The Lost Girls, which speaks about the real-life mystery of the Long Island serial killer. Now, this film is nowhere even close to bigger thrillers like Seven or Zodiac, who really have you on the edge of your seat throughout the whole plot. But I think that the most interesting aspect of this film is that although the real-life investigation revealed 10 to 20 bodies, many people have never ever heard of this story. The film mainly focuses on the family of one victim in particular, who the family are desperately looking for, but whose search reveals the bodies of other girls. It sparks the whole larger investigation. The saddest part about this film and the actual real-life investigation is that because many of the victims were associated with being prostitutes, the investigation took a path it shouldn't have taken, and probably wouldn't have taken if the demographic of the victims had been different. So it gives us a lot to chew on. Then, believe it or not, I watched, for the first time ever, Kick-Ass, which, confession time, for years I had mistaken with Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, which I also still need to watch. Kick-Ass is the superhero name a regular kid gives himself after deciding he wants to create a new identity as a superhero, even if he doesn't have any powers. He thinks this is a reasonably easy job until he starts to get into trouble with crime bosses, and he also meets other people who have dedicated their whole life to becoming superheroes. They have trained for that. Although this film has received a lot of criticism, I think it's hilarious because it's very self-ironic. It's a fun take on some comic-based films which take themselves way too seriously. Another film you probably won't believe I only watched for the first time now in 2020 is Clueless, but which has been around for such a long time and has been so heavily featured online that I actually knew more or less what the plot was about, and I had seen most of the most iconic scenes, but I never sat down and watched the whole thing from start to end. The protagonist in Clueless is a very rich and entitled high school girl who enjoys this chic lifestyle with her best friends, and she isn't particularly socially conscious. Things start to change when a new and very different girl joins school and befriends the protagonist, who start to reflect on their approach to the world. I think that with this film, people are torn between itching to compare it to Mean Girls and boldly defending it as a film of its own. I think Mean Girls is more comedic. It has some more straightforward funny scenes, while Clueless is more of a romantic teenage story which turns out to be funny because of how the protagonist behaves. The same day I watched another oldish film called Unfaithful, in which the protagonist is unfaithful. Summarising the plot very briefly, Richard Gere portrays a very busy, bossy man who loves his family very dearly, but who has a very straightforward, business-like approach to things. So his wife lives a very wealthy lifestyle, she has everything she could ever want, but when she meets a young, French, artsy, passionate man, she falls for him mostly because of his free bohemian attitude, and they start having an affair. I think this film correctly depicts everything that an affair entails and how it affects all the parties involved from many different points of view. It wasn't really one of my favourite films of the month, and I think that in some moments it was trying a little too much to justify certain behaviours, but I guess that altogether it wasn't really that terrible. That same evening, yes, I know I watched a lot that day, I watched Pet Sematary, mostly because I'd meant to see it at the cinema when it first came out, and Amazon Prime Video was pushing it in my face every time I logged onto the platform, and as we all know, I always fall victim to the Big Brother, and I watched it. Now, Pet Sematary is very hard to explain without giving away spoilers, but skipping around the main revealing facts, a family moves into a new house, and this new house borders onto an animal cemetery, a place where people can bury their pets. But of course, this being a horror movie, that cemetery is no regular place. Things can happen there and even affect humans. I really don't know how to say this without spoilers. This is no masterpiece horror, but it's the perfect popcorn on the sofa Friday night film with your friends after the quarantine is over. On that topic, I watched another horror film which is totally different. It's absolutely not the Final Destination or Paranormal Activity kind of horror film you would watch with your friends commenting on all the absurd things that happen. It's rather the film you'd watch with a more introspective mood, a fancy drink and a fancy dinner. It's called A Ghost Story, and this film received a lot of credit and discredit for the same identical reasons. To sum the film up in one sentence, the story covers the life of a man who dies and becomes a ghost haunting the house where his wife still lives. The film has very few lines of dialogue, and it mostly follows the ghost moving around the house and other connected environments while we reflect upon what happened, grief, and moving on after death. In addition to that, it was filmed in a particular ratio which purposely makes you feel as if you were trapped in a box, and it has many long scenes, for example one in which Rooney Mara just sits on the floor in her kitchen and eats a whole pie for 10 minutes straight. So on the one hand, people have complained about this film being too slow, while others have praised the symbology throughout the story and the way the theme of grief is covered. I can see the reasoning behind both points of view. I really liked some scenes, but it's definitely not a film I'll want to rewatch anytime soon. I then watched a really fun film I had seen the trailer for a few months back, but which then I had completely forgotten about, and that is Fighting with My Family, starring Florence Pugh. This film is based on the real story of a family in England who dedicate their whole life to wrestling. Everybody in the family is involved in the wrestling industry, they even organise their own shows, but they're still limited to their small town world. But everything changes when the daughter, Florence Pugh, is picked to be trained for the WWE over in the United States, and she discovers the difference between hometown wrestling and putting on a professional show. This film is really, really fun. It's hilarious when it needs to be hilarious, it's deep in the right moments. If you like films with Nick Frost, for example, the Cornetto trilogy, or even very self-ironic films, for example, Baywatch with The Rock, you will enjoy this film. After that, I watched a huge classic, which, believe it or not, I hadn't seen yet. But I watched Apocalypse Now for the first time in 2020. Apocalypse Now is one of the biggest films of the 70s, and of all time really, and it is one of the biggest films to cover the topic of the Vietnam War. It's the story of a secret mission to find a high-ranking United States officer who is hidden away in Vietnam, not following any rules, commanding in his own way, and presumably going insane. So the film opens briefly introducing us to this premise, to the soldier who is appointed to the mission, and then it jumps into a full hour of one of the most mind-blowing battle scenes ever. This was one of the few Vietnam War scenes which made me think of how it was just a complete nightmare. This film really grabs your attention. Overall, it's pretty long and intense. It follows the style of its time. but it is one of those classic films you have to watch at some point. Then, just to keep things a little varied, I rewatched Pets, because we were looking for Pets 2 on Netflix, couldn't find it, weren't bothered to look for it elsewhere, and just rewatched the first chapter. Again, just as with Sing, I could vaguely remember the general outline of the plot, but not the details. It's the story of a group of pets that end up lost outside their houses, on the streets of New York, and are trying to find their way home. These are fancy city pets who aren't able to get by in life without the help of their owners, and they have to deal with stray animals who are portrayed as street thugs, gangsters. The funniest part of this film for adults, just as with Zootopia and Sing, are all the additional details. For example, the fact that Kevin Hart voices this thug bunny, but who is all cute and fluffy and called Snowball. Another film on Netflix, and one that Netflix has been trying to make me watch for months, is 1922, based on the short story of the same name by the master of terror, Stephen King. As the title suggests, the film is set in 1922 on a farmhouse somewhere deep in the rural Nebraska countryside, where a married couple fight over many issues, including whether they should sell a portion of the land and whether they should even continue as a couple. But things escalate to the point that Mr. Husband murders Mrs. Wife. But that's when things start to get really messed up. I don't want to spoil the story too much, but I must say that I agree with what most viewers say about this film. It's not so much of a splatter horror film, but more of a depressing depiction of what the consequences of bad choices are. Actually, many famous films based on Stephen King works, for example, The Green Mile, The Shining, Carrie, always have something more than just the straightforward, pure horror element, and that's what makes them so compelling. Then I watched American Honey, an interesting and dazzling story of a young woman from a very poor and troubled background who is offered the job opportunity of traveling around the country with a door-to-door sales crew. It isn't a huge job opportunity, and getting on with the other crew members can be tough at times, but at least she gets to be away from some of her problems at home, she has a roof over her head, and she gets to meet new people, for example Jake, portrayed by Shia LaBeouf. I had no doubts LaBeouf would have been amazing here. He's always been able to make us forget that he is just another actor taking on yet another role, and he totally convinces us that he is that character. In this case, his role is that of the mysterious, attractive, but also a bit dodgy co-worker who manages to charm everybody, but who can also be quite a pain and a little too above board. So although the story is a little repetitive and it is nearly 3 hours long, the wonderful photography, the cast chemistry, and the amazing soundtrack really made the time fly by. I then finally caught up with the film you have all been suggesting for a very long time, a film I knew I would like, a film that always popped up as recommended, and so basically a film I knew I had to watch before spoilers came too close to me, and that is The Machinist. This is the famous film in which Christian Bale looks like this, as he portrays a man who is tormented day and night by various thoughts. He claims he hasn't been able to sleep in ages, and soon odd events begin to occur at his workplace and later in his private life. So he tries to piece together the facts, he tries to figure out what is happening, but the more he digs and the more everything gets confusing, leading on to an astonishing ending. If I have to be honest, this film didn't surprise me as much as other "you have to watch this twice" films, mostly because every single piece of information you can find about The Machinist refers to a mind-blowing ending, something unexpected, a storyline which confuses you. It's never presented as a regular story, which then turns out to be weird. So the surprise factor kind of comes less here. But ignoring all of that, the film was pretty impressive, and it gets you so caught up in the events that in the end it only feels like a short story. Coming up next on the list is a film which actually goes by 3 different titles. The Platform, also known as El Hoyo, and also known as The Hole. Whatever title you prefer, it's a Spanish film based on the concept of a prison built on different levels, and with one food platform moving between these levels. As there are countless levels throughout the whole prison, theoretically, if the people above only ate the appropriate necessary amount of food, there would be enough for the people below. but that never works out for a series of reasons I will not spoil, as well as there being many other strict rules the prisoners must follow. This is a very interesting and provocative film because the prison system becomes a metaphor for our approach to society in general, of how we only act with our personal well-being in mind and how our conditions can affect the way we approach other people. Okay, then each month there seems to be a teen-oriented film. For example, last month it was To All the Boys I've Loved Before. But the film I watched this month was actually suitable for older audiences because the topic it covers isn't strictly an adolescent issue. The film I'm speaking about is To the Bone, which covers the topic of eating disorders. In particular, it follows the life of a young woman who is struggling with anorexia and is admitted to a specialised care home to follow an inpatient treatment. At the beginning of the film, I mistakenly thought it was going to go down the path of the eating disorders are bad, but we also picked a quirky main character who still looks beautiful with her grunge clothing and big sunglasses and smoky eye makeup. But cleverly, that was the phase in which the protagonist still thought she had everything under control. She is very ironic about it, but as soon as she is admitted into the house with other patients with similar situations, the film takes a deeper twist and starts showing us and the protagonist how it's not all a joke or a trend or a social media aesthetic, but rather a life-threatening issue which affects everybody close to the patient. So it turned out to be a film that attracts younger audiences, but which then tackles the topic in a very mature manner. My next pick was a film from the 90s, A Time to Kill, starring Matthew McConaughey, Kevin Spacey, Sandra Bullock, Samuel L. Jackson. It had a huge cast. A Time to Kill is set in a small town in which racism and racist acts regularly occur. For example, the film opens with two men raping and nearly killing a young girl. The girl's father, Samuel L. Jackson, is beyond furious with what happened, especially knowing that these men are probably going to get away with their crime. To solve the problem, he decides to take the matter in his own hands and kill the men, then hiring a lawyer, Matthew McConaughey, to defend him in a very controversial courtroom case. The story is provocative, stimulating, because it gets us thinking about what we would have done in that situation and what justice actually is. A Time to Kill was actually one of 3 big legal thrillers I watched this month. The other one was The Client, a story of 2 children who are randomly playing in some woods when they stumble across a man with huge ties to the mafia who is about to commit suicide. Because of this, these children become potential sponges of information. This guy could have confessed before killing himself. So they are hounded by the press on the one side and hunted down by mobsters who want to silence them on the other, while lawyers bicker over all the legal proceedings surrounding the case. Instead, the third legal thriller I watched was High Crimes, which is very hard to introduce without revealing spoilers. Putting it down rather bluntly, it is the story of a former soldier who is accused of brutally murdering a group of civilians during a mission in a rural town in El Salvador. The information about the massacre is very confusing. There are issues with witnesses, with proof of facts, with people who might be covering up what actually happened. It's a mess. It's a mess that actually requires more than one lawyer, one of which is actually portrayed by Morgan Freeman. But out of these 3 films, the one I like the most and the one I would definitely recommend is A Time to Kill. Then halfway into the month and a good couple of weeks into lockdown, I felt I needed something a little more cheerful to watch compared to The Machinist at 2 AM. And I asked you guys for some recommendations. And I'll never be grateful enough because you sent in a ton of suggestions and I started watching them. The first title I picked was I Love You, Philip Morris, a delightful film starring Ewan McGregor and Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey portrays a man who is good at heart, who wants the best for himself and his boyfriend, but who achieves that through a variety of different fraud schemes, which get him in a lot of trouble and from which he tries to get out in every possible way. This film is basically unknown. I had never seen it promoted anywhere, but I can't stress this enough. please go watch it. It had me laughing out loud at the screen in some moments, crying my eyes out in the next. I loved it. I would definitely recommend it. The other title I picked from your recommendations is Super Deluxe, an Indian film which isn't necessarily the most cheerful, but which definitely gets your mind off of things for a couple of hours. This film can be a bit complex. It follows different storylines, but which then eventually tie together somehow. There is a story of a woman who cheats on her husband, but during sex, the partner dies and she has to figure out what to do with the body, how to cover the whole story up. Then there's the story of a father who leaves his family, only to later return as a transsexual woman, alarming his family, and then having to deal with the closed mentality of his neighborhood. And the third storyline is that of three young friends who don't have just one main circumstance, but who end up in various troubled situations. They get a lot of things messed up. I know there are many people who still think that Indian films are one big ultra-choreographed musical with a dramatic love story thrown in and Power Ranger-style explosions in the background. So films like Super Deluxe are really showing the world what Indian cinema looks like now in the 21st century. I am slowly catching up with the other cheerful films you recommended, so stay tuned in the next videos to see what I think about them. I also made my own solo attempt at looking for something a little cheerful as I watched the romantic comedy Always Be My Maybe. This is a very unpretentious film. This is very light-hearted. It's the kind of romantic comedy you would watch once or twice, have a laugh, and that's it. It's the story of two childhood friends who at one point in high school even had something a little romantic going on before adulthood arrived and they each went their own way. Sasha becomes a fancy, wealthy entrepreneur, while Marcus remains close to home, working in the family business and staying humble. One day, years later, they meet again, and you can imagine how the story goes on from there. In reality, this film has some very self-ironic moments, especially at the scenes with Keanu Reeves, who had me gasping for air from how much I was laughing. So it nearly felt like a parody of your typical love story. But then it would always fall back into the usual cliches of a romantic comedy. So again, it's something you might watch once or twice just to put a smile back on your face, but not a classic pick. Now, in the completely different from every other film on today's list category is Pretty Liars, a Nigerian movie I spoke about in my more detailed Crazy Nigerian Movies video, and which became famous worldwide because of the "Why are you running" meme.
Why are you running? Why are you running?
So although the Nigerian film industry is one of the most prolific in the whole world, the budget of most of their companies is very limited compared to what is behind some of the big blockbusters we are used to seeing in cinemas. For this reason, Nigerian films and African films as a whole have been ridiculed by those who stick to the safe side of things, if you will. But I love the idea of always trying something new. As you've seen on today's list, I watched Apocalypse Now the same evening of Sing, and a few days later I was watching Indian teenagers wishing they could meet Sunny Leone, followed by Shia LaBeouf slapping tanning lotion onto Elvis Presley's granddaughter's legs. And we're still not even at the end of the list. Always be open to try something new. Anyway, the Nigerian film in this case, Pretty Liars, is the story of women who aren't wealthy, but who create a fake and rich and bossy appearance to basically have it easier in life. Because of this attitude they display, rather than receiving a better treatment, they usually get themselves into arguments and sticky situations from which they try to get out in a very chaotic manner. But as we are speaking of uncommon works, March was the month in which I finally watched The Death of Dick Long. So this film already had a tease in the title, it had a bit of a naughty poster, but I was sure it was just to attract attention and that it would have followed the line of other films such as Swiss Army Man, which at the time promoted itself as a castaway guy using a dead body as a Swiss Army knife, before we realised the actual plot went into full psychological analysis mode. I knew The Death of Dick Long would have followed along similar lines, also because it's produced by A24, a company which tends to be a little picky about unique, uncommon, interesting storylines. The film is set in a rural town in which everybody knows each other and everybody has a pretty regular slow-going life. Our main characters are a group of friends who enjoy their time together, drinking, playing music, joking about, until one evening something happens and one of them gets seriously hurt. The film doesn't really show us much more than that, just the friends dumping him in front of a hospital and then escaping. So the rest of the plot tries to put together the pieces of what actually happened that night, and it just gets more and more messed up. So if you're looking for something different, very different, a little bit odd, this might be a good choice. Probably 18 plus though. Another uncommon pick for the month was a film, but which this time was weird. I'm speaking about Gummo, a film from the 90s which feels more like a documentary. It covers the life of the inhabitants of a small town in Ohio which doesn't offer many life opportunities or pastimes. The characters don't really have a particular direction in life, they mostly live day by day, and there are many weird situations going on, many inappropriate situations. In some moments it looked a lot like some of the older Marilyn Manson music videos. I'm really trying to not spoil anything about this film because the weirdness of the story is better experienced without knowing anything about the plot. I know some have criticised this film for not really having a point, not really having a sense, and I get where that's coming from. But some of the situations depicted in Gummo would not have had the same impact if they'd been portrayed in a regular movie style. The choice of the odd documentary style, the inconsistent audio and cinematography feel really more like an appropriate choice. Instead, probably what wasn't an appropriate choice for myself during this worldwide pandemic was watching a film called It Comes at Night, about people hiding away, far away from others to avoid contagion by something very dangerous. I'm not going to say much more about this, as I haven't said much more about the other horror films on this list. But this movie in reality never goes down the World War Z 28 Days Later kind of horror pandemic film, but it rather analyses the scenario of social isolation, of fear, and of trying to trust other people, but while trying to protect your own family. If you don't feel like watching this kind of film under the present circumstances, that is understandable, but it's definitely not the usual contamination, outbreak, panic style of film. Another film which is about isolation, but not necessarily terrible to watch right now, is Vivarium, with Jesse Eisenberg and Imogen Poots. In this film, the two actors portray a young couple who are house hunting. One day they visit a brand new neighborhood, but instead of just making a short visit to one of the houses, they end up stuck in the area. The whole neighborhood is a sort of maze, they can't leave, and after trying to get out in many ways, they realize they're forced to stay there, isolated from the rest of the world in one of these houses. Not only that, they then receive a mysterious box containing a baby and a message stating that the only way out of that situation is by raising the child. So although this film is about isolation, I don't think it's that bad to watch at the moment, mostly because everything that happens in that film is completely far away from anything we will experience during this time. Let's put it like that because I don't want to say anything more to not spoil the plot. Instead, a much funnier film I watched is The Polka King. A very unplanned choice of movie I randomly saw on Netflix and decided to watch without even reading up about it. I just saw Jack Black and I clicked. The Polka King is the true story of a Polish immigrant to the United States who has a rather successful polka band but who is struggling financially. After working multiple jobs to barely make ends meet, he decides to start making money by organising various investment schemes and high-stake projects which even involve the Pope or Miss Pennsylvania. It is a roller coaster of money found, money lost, of the police involved. It was a mess, but it was so funny to watch, especially knowing that this was actually a real story that really happened. I know many have criticised Jack Black in this film for having more of a standard Eastern European accent rather than a specifically Polish one, and the film consequently being very cringeworthy. I can't speak for the accent, but I think it was generally a pretty funny film, and it had that absurd Nacho Libre School of Rock kind of humour, which is funny because the characters are completely convinced of what they're doing. That's where the humour comes from. Following the Pulp Cooking on the list is a movie called Guns Akimbo, which became famous because of this photo of Daniel Radcliffe on set wearing basically nothing except for a dressing gown and huge furry slippers, pointing guns with a crazy expression on his face. And I decided to watch the film just to figure out what was actually going on there. Basically, Guns Akimbo is set in a future in which people enjoy watching other people fight to death. Real people fight to death. It's a sort of millennial version of Gamer with Gerard Butler. Daniel Radcliffe's character is forced into taking part into this deadly game. He is assigned to an enemy and his only way out is by killing the enemy or being killed himself. Although he totally isn't the Gerard Butler action kind of guy. As a matter of fact, the funniest aspect of the film, in my opinion, is that it makes fun of many action film / video game cliches. So the actors actually behave how people in real life would react under those circumstances. They say normal things in a relatable way, which obviously then appears even more out of context and even funnier. Okay, we've nearly reached the end of the list. I watched The Incredibles 2, which, yes, I know was released like 2 or 3 years ago. I was really excited to watch it back at the time, but then I read like one negative review, and I don't know why I acted like a total sheep, and I thought, you know what, I'll watch it sometime later on, and it took 3 years. But we're here now, better late than never. The Incredibles is an animated saga based on a world in which superheroes are not always seen in the best manner, because of some incidents in which probably just calling the police would have resulted in a less dangerous situation. The protagonists are a group of superheroes who, regardless of this, still try to do some good in the world, while also having to solve their own personal family issues. Now, I'm just going to say it. The first film was better than the second one, and I don't think we really cared about what the new action background storyline was about. We just wanted to see new sketches involving the family members, and we were curious about what the Underminer would do. I mean, I barely felt captivated by the whole action story behind the second chapter, and I was only excited when the film showed the characters and their various characteristics. But I know many people enjoyed this film, so if you have seen it, remember to leave a comment down below and let me know your opinion. I then found a series on Netflix which I binge watched in one evening, Unorthodox. This series is based on the real story of a woman who used to belong to a close-knit community of Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn, New York. Everybody in that community, up till today, follow very, very strict rules. As soon as people become of age, there is an arranged wedding, and then the women are required to have as many children as possible, most of them averaging 10 children by the age of 40. They basically live without the internet, hardly speaking any English, even if it's New York, and this is especially tough for women. I mean, even girls' faces are blacked out with markers in kids' elementary school books. So Unorthodox follows the story of a young woman who felt like she didn't fit in that community and tried to escape to Berlin, even though she had no particular skills or experience outside the reality she had grown up in. I love this series because it has a very mature approach to the topic. It shows everybody's point of view and it never falls into melodramatic cliches. It made me think a lot about the concept of identity, of group identity, and of what freedom really is. I then watched a film starring Natalie Portman, Jake Gyllenhaal. It'd actually been a while since I'd seen one of his films, and Tobey Maguire. It's called Brothers. In this film, Jake Gyllenhaal portrays the troublesome brother, the one that just came out of jail, is always in some sort of trouble, while Tobey Maguire is the sensible home dad and, most importantly, an army captain. Now, without spoilers, and this could be pretty hard, Tobey Maguire's character leaves for Afghanistan, and something happens in Afghanistan, something big and nasty. So his wife, Natalie Portman, is left alone at home. She has to look after her children, look after the house, and troublesome brother Jake Gyllenhaal starts to take in the role of the father figure in the house. He starts helping around, looking after the children. So the film offers a lot to chew on regarding loneliness anger, resentment, jealousy, a lot of different emotions. And I personally think that Tobey Maguire gave a fantastic interpretation of his role here. And now, the last film I watched in March, I watched it late on the 31st, and that is Waves. Dazzling story of a family dealing with many issues, most of them involving the son who has everything he could ever want in life, but who is still struggling to find his place. Now, when I first started watching this film, I thought, okay, here goes again. The pretty Tumblr film about the spoilt rich kid who goes to aesthetic parties and fights with his parents. But then in reality, the film takes a very unexpected and thought-provoking path. Under many aspects, Waves reminded me a little of Euphoria, a series which depicts teenagers struggling with different issues and the snowball effect that that has on their family and their environment. Waves was absolutely fantastic. It was one of the films that reminded me of how important my love for cinema is in my life. And bonus factor, I didn't know anything about this film because I didn't watch the trailer. It has Lucas Hedges in, and you all know how I love him as an actor and how I'm always looking out for more of his roles. But with that, we have finished today's list. If you're still watching, thank you so much. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the films of the series I spoke about today, and also I'd love to hear what you've been watching, so please let me know with a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you soon in a new one. Bye.